Hi, welcome to another episode of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. I believe this is the 10th episode of the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on settlement patterns in Germany over time. Um, just to give you a background, so on my podcast, we focus on German cultural topics, a bit about the language, and yeah, that's really the main focus. As I started off really starting, I really started off focusing on specifically German, but I really started off with German language first, and then from German language, then I moved on to German culture. And I'm now becoming more interested in culture around the world. So I think we'll expand the topic range to maybe other countries or other different types of societies because Germany is unique to other European countries, but I feel that many European countries are relatively similar. Like, I think if we were to do a deep dive into another country, it might be in South America or something, maybe Asia. Um, but I think that's where the podcast is going in the future. And we're going to focus a lot about different societies, different cultures, how they live. You might focus on some people who are invisibly suffering, some people that are being marginalized in the world and that nobody really knows about to bring awareness to that. But we're also just gonna, on a more positive note, just learn and understand more countries, more cultures, and see if there are anything. Because I think the point of that is to you can one understand because it's better to know more about the world because many of us really only know about even in the United States, like we really only know about the people who live similar lives to us. In different geographical regions, right? In different territories of the United States, people lived very differently. And people live even more differently different parts of the world. And sometimes other people that you've never even thought of before are doing something that you think is really cool and you can take that and use it in your own lifestyle. So yeah, so that's where the podcast is going in the future. Up until now, this is the 10th episode. The first 9 episodes, I focused on German immigration to the United States, um, a little bit of German culture stuff with soccer because I like soccer a lot, and Germany's a big soccer country. And then we focused mainly, though, on some philosophers, Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx, and yeah, and German architecture was the most recent topic. This podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any real platform, and I'm recording it with Anchor. So yeah, let's just get started with settlement patterns in Germany over time. So starting off, let's focus on rural settlement. So the most striking feature, in my opinion, of the rural settlement pattern in Western Germany is probably the concentration of the farmyards into extremely large villages. And these large villages, they're known as the German word for it is Hufendörfer. Hufendörfer is the word. And these villages or Hufendörfers are they're surrounded almost by fields, by enclosed fields that are often divided into hundreds of units. And the Hufendorf is it's a characteristic of southwestern Germany and areas that have a tradition really of portable inheritance. And during periods, of population pressure, land holdings as well as farmhouses and farmyards, they were repeatedly divided in Germany on inheritance. Um, and they kept becoming more smaller and more fragmented. And as a result of this, them becoming more smaller and fragmented, the villages became increasingly huddled and chaotic, and because people were more concentrated, and in areas with undivided inheritance, the holdings, the individual fields and farmhouses, they were made larger. So right now, just to give you a stat. In 2018, the urban-rural breakdown in Germany, so 77% of people in Germany are urban, and rural is 23%. But we'll come back to that later. I had a graph in there, so I wanted just to mention so I didn't forget it because I thought that was important. But during the period of high medieval prosperity in the 11th to 13th centuries, the population pressure, which we were talking about before, right, with the fragmented villages, and that led to more chaos. This population pressure brought about the advance of peasant settlements into the forests because there was not space anymore for people because the villages became so concentrated. And now, because peasants were starting to move out, settle in forests, they were isolated farms and hamlets where they were the usual settlement form and almost the colonization of the predominantly Slavic lands beyond the line of Elbe and Saale rivers. And because this was an organized colonization under the control of the lords and their agents, the structure of the Western Hofendorf could be streamlined into many different well-planned forms. So, farmhouses, for example, in the eastern regions were customarily arranged along either a single village street, and these are called Strassendorfs. Um, and I believe, by the way, I think Dorf means home because Strassen means street in German. So, anyways, that's getting off topic though. But Strassendorfs are the single village streets that farmhouses in the eastern regions were customarily arranged along. And you also have Angerdorfs, which were churches. And these Angerdorfs, well, the churches aren't Angerdorfs. The churches were on these pieces of land called Angerdorfs, and these Angerdorfs were long, unfenced strips of land and allotted at right angles to the road or green. And the evolution of rural settlement in Germany, it hasn't been uniform. Instead, there have been different phrases of advance and retreat, and there's no real consistent uh, movement. So, in particular, the decline of medieval prosperity, along with the Black Death, right, that decimated much of Europe's population in the 14th century, this led to a major state of retreat, and in basically hundreds of villages, and these are called, by the way, the lost villages. They were abandoned in Western Germany. And Eastern German lords, they often appropriated desert farms and they added them to their own land. So they initiated a characteristic feature of the area beyond the Elbe River and the large Junker estate farm. And the organization of agriculture and settlement in Eastern and Western Germany, it really diverged considerably after World War II. Because in Western Germany, federal and state governments, they provided large subsidies to improve the existing structure. In land consolidation, it created not only larger holdings, but also in some places, farmers were moved to farmsteads dispersed outside the villages. And then an increased average size, I guess you could say, of holding was associated with a massive movement of people out of agriculture. And instead of leaving for the cities, because they were the movement out of agriculture, they didn't go to cities, which occurred in the 19th century. And remember, the 19th century is the 1800s. So instead of leaving the cities, people mostly remained in their existing homes and they commuted to work. And land was actually left uncultivated by the new urban workers who left cities into the farmland. And some of this land was cultivated by the few remaining farmers, but many, many areas where people from cities moved into the rural areas, that was uncultivated, and um, many of these areas were forested or they reverted to rough grass and scrub. Now, in East Germany, the Junker estates, they were confiscated, and they were either divided among peasants or turned into state farms. And this development was only the first stage in a process of collectivization from 1958 to 1960. And basically, what happened was private holdings were regrouped under heavy political pressure, and they were regrouped into vast cooperative farms. And these new buildings, they really marked the introduction of cultivation and large-scale animal husbandry and multi-story apartments and community centers. They reflected a politically inspired attempt almost to create a new concept of rural life. And after unification, rural settlement patterns and agriculture were once again transformed in eastern Germany, with the decline of about three-fourths in agricultural employment. And following this, few private farms were reestablished, and very large areas were fallowed. Um, Moving on from rural to urban settlement, so starting back in time, so since medieval times, Germany has really been politically fragmented, and you've had many numerous states competing with one another to almost develop a lucrative market and to create capitals, large and small. And as a result, the country inherited a profusion of towns and cities, really. And most of these towns and cities, they remained frozen within their circuit of walls until the 19th century, with only really, the larger princely capitals like Berlin and Munich developing distinctive government quarters in the early modern period. And the great, I guess you could say, you could call it an urban explosion. It came in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, really, in Germany. And because industrialization was linked largely to the development of the railways, urban expansion was not confined to areas near the coal fields, but instead was like distributed to many cities. And typically, the new urban workers, they were herded in dismal five-story apartment blocks built on, grid straight-line streets. And today, especially in eastern Berlin and cities like Dresden and Leipzig, these blocks present an urgent problem of urban renewal. And yeah, and it remains a problem today too. Now, following World War II, there was a period of rapid, really rapid urban growth because you had many evacuees from the war, right? Many people left. They returned to the bombed cities because during the war, um, and this is really a consistent theme you'll see throughout any wars in any countries, um, any war in any country. Um, People will leave the cities because the cities are going to be targeted, and they're going to go to the countryside, and they're going to try and find an area that's far away from everybody and settle in there because those areas are much more safer, especially at times of war. So this happened in Germany as well. So because of this, after World War II, right, many people who could, by the way, not everybody could leave a city because some people were really struggling. They had to continue to work, 'cause otherwise they'd starve. So, but the people that could leave cities, they left cities, and then after World War II, they came back to the cities. So this caused rapid urban growth. And after 1949, however, contrasting government policies, they led to divergent urban development in Eastern and Western Germany. So in West Germany, many people abandoned the old city in favor of suburbs and urbanized villages within commuting range. So thus, this led to almost a population loss that was associated with peripheral gain. On the other hand, the East German government pursued a policy of population concentration, where people were moved into concentrated peripheral settlements of 50,000 to 100,000, consisting of uniform prefabricated high rise housing blocks built at the immediate outskirts of larger towns and cities. And the economic growth and change in post war Germany led to the loss of considerable heritage, really, of historic buildings, and that compounded the losses suffered during World War II. However, during the last decades of the 20th century, virtually all Western German towns and cities they began to restore the historic buildings for a variety of eras and architectural styles. Because a lot of people don't think of this as a loss of war, but it's really significant. Many people only think about human lives as the only loss of war, and that's true. It's probably the most important thing, but another important thing, it's not as important as human lives, but very important, is there's a lot of history that's destroyed in many cities, and especially in Germany. We spent a podcast discussing German architecture because they're famous for their architecture. They're very classical architecture. A lot of it was destroyed during the war, and while they did lose a lot, and a lot was replaced with more modern architecture, they tried to replace and replicate some stuff. And um and yeah, so they did try and replicate some stuff. So this process of rebuilding um occurred more slowly in the East prior to unification, but preservation efforts really increased beginning in the 1990s. So we focus on rural and urban. Now let's take a look at migration and migrate and demographic trends. So after World War II, Germany received more than 12 million refugees and refugees from former German territory east of the Oder and from areas with substantial German ethnic populations in Central and Eastern Europe. And these numbers, they were swollen by the ranks of displaced persons who were non-Germans unwilling to return to their former homelands. And after Germany was partitioned in 1949, the demographic histories of the two parts of the country diverged, with West Germany becoming the prime target of continuing migration flows. And although immigrants, principally ethnic Germans, they continued to drift in from the east, their numbers were overshadowed by a mass desertion of some 2 million people from East Germany. And because these immigrants from East Germany were mostly young and highly skilled, their arrival was a major gain to the booming West German economy. And it really hurt the East German economy because you had many people who wanted to pursue, who wanted to advance their education, become doctors or lawyers or whatever they wanted to do. And East Germany wouldn't support them economically the same way that West Germany would. So a lot of the smartest and brightest people from East Germany left, and that hurt East Germany a lot, and it helped West Germany a lot. And that's part of the reason, not the only reason that there was such a massive economic difference between the two, but part of the reason. And in 1961, the East German government blocked, further desertion of its people by building the Berlin Wall, and that's one of the reasons they did it. One of the prime reasons, major reasons the Berlin Wall was built, was that all the smartest East Germans were leaving, getting out of East Germany. So they wanted to stop that. They wanted the smartest people to stay, to help the East German economy. So after the Berlin Wall, right, East Germans enjoyed relatively demographic tranquility for most of the following 3 decades. But after the disintegration of communist regimes throughout Central and Eastern Europe, however, the population of West Germany began to surge again. And because of flows first from newly liberalized Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and then from East Germany, after the inter-German boundary was opened on November 9th, 1989, which was the same day the Berlin Wall fell. That same year, and remember, that's only um, 2 months left in that year, 700,000 East Germans poured into West Germany. And this continued from 1994 to 1997. Net immigration occurred at a sharply reduced rate before increasing again because of ongoing economic problems in East Germany. So, just to give you some stats to the put everything into perspective. The German, so I'm going to tell you the percentage of German resident foreign populations. So, 15% of German residents were born in Turkey, 8% in Poland, 6% in Syria, another 6% in Italy, 5% in Romania, 5% in Africa, 3% in Greece, 3% in Croatia, and 2.6% in Bulgaria, and 45% other. And the arrival of these new migrants, it caused some resentment among Western Germans because, the pressure is placed on an already overburdened housing market and social services because there were so many people and they didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the facilities or the capacity to take in so many people. And but because the new arrivals were mainly young and skilled, it helped. They were actually able to solve the problem, and they fueled a post-unification boom in Western Germany, and they continue to drain the economy and society in the East, which still today, by the way, faces economic and social problems. Several hundred thousand East Germans also created jobs in Western Germany. Um, to spur economic growth, West Germany began as early as the mid 1950s to encourage workers to migrate from other countries. At first, these migrants were to be considered guest workers, coming to work for a limited period of time only. But increasingly they sent for their families. And even when economic recession occurred in 1973 and the further immigration of workers was discouraged, the number of foreign residents continued to grow, and it reached more than 7 million people, which was nearly one-tenth of the total by the beginning of the 21st century. And because of higher birth rates among the foreign population, non-Germans have accounted for a majority of the natural population growth since the 1950s. And I don't know this for sure because right now we're focusing only on Germany, but I would imagine that's the same for many of the major countries, or many, like I could see that being the same for the US, for maybe England. So, yeah, that's interesting. That's something I'm going to explore in another podcast too. But the Turks, or people from Turkey, represent the largest group of foreign residents, followed by Polish people, Syrians, Italians, and Romanians. Like I said with the stats, right? People from Turkey, 15%, 8% Poland, 6% Syria, 6% Italy, and 5% Romania. And immigrants typically, like they were in the United States for many years, were employed in the heaviest, dirtiest, and the worst jobs, really, that no one else wanted to take. And in times of economic difficulty, they were generally the first to lose their jobs and the last to be reemployed. So they really struggled. And their children, of whom more than four-fifths had been born in Germany, they're among the last to be considered for an apprenticeship or training place. And immigrants also inhabit the least desirable housing in Germany. For Turks, for example, in particular, they've formed distinctive quarters in the poorest inner city areas. And although the East German state prided itself on its non reliance on guest workers, some um, Poles, Vietnamese, Angolans, Cubans, they were imported ostensibly for education and training. And, with the opening of the eastern frontiers and a more almost liberal attitude, I guess you could say, of the Soviet Union towards immigration, The influx of ethnic Germans became a veritable flood. Nearly 400,000 came in 1989, and this was followed by 200,000 more annually between 1991 and 1995. And subsequently, the number of immigrants fell, but it still remains substantial, really, really big. And these new immigrants were, less easily assimilated into Western German culture than those from Eastern Germany, because many had difficulties with the German language, they lacked marketable skills. But with some apprehension, United Germans realized that a further million ethnic Germans could arrive from Eastern Europe in the future, and there was a further fear that the freedom and the freedom to travel and political or economic problems might produce a flow of untold millions of non-German residents of the former Soviet Union. And partially in response to these concerns, Germany's relations with Russia focused on attempting to improve um, the lot of ethnic Germans living in Russia. Thereby, it diminished the likelihood of a mass immigration of those ethnic Germans in Russia coming into Germany. Because Germany didn't want to take so many people because they just couldn't. It was not possible for them to. And an oversaturated population is not good. It's dangerous. And nobody wins with an oversaturated population too. So they attempted to, because a lot of immigrants, some people came for political freedom, but in economic freedom, but a lot of people mainly came because they're where they were living, they were really struggling and things weren't going well, and they wanted to get out. And that's really the primary motivation for many, many immigrants. If everything was going well where they were living, they wouldn't leave. But when things don't go well, they want to get out. And Germany is a first world country. People knows it's an attractive country. So Germany tried to solve the problem by helping those immigrants in other countries improve their conditions so that they wouldn't come to Germany. Now, West Germany's constitution, it guarantees the right of asylum to those forced to flee their native countries because of political oppression, and this privilege was regarded as compensation for the asylum granted to 800,000 German victims of political and ethnic persecution during World War II. Now, criticism of this constitutional provision mounted in the 1980s, with the arrival of asylum seekers from non-European countries such as Sri Lanka, Iran, Lebanon, Ghana, and India. And together with stateless Palestinians, it was difficult to distinguish those hoping to better themselves economically or to avoid compulsory military service from genuine victims of oppression. And it became really muddled, really, that's the bottom line. And the issue of asylum, it became even more pressing when the eastern borders were opened and when a flood of foreigners were admitted, most prominently Poles, Romanians, Bosniaks. And between 1990 and 1993, 1 million people sought asylum in Germany. And as antagonism towards immigrants increased by the native Germans, there was a surge of violent attacks against foreigners. And although the government and citizens condemned such xenophobic sentiment and behavior, foreigners continue to be subjected to discrimination and sporadic violence. And beginning in 1991, legislation actually brought Germany in line with the more restrictive policies practiced by other members of the European Union. And it regarded um, immigration from outside the community with those practices in a different way than Germany had done so before. Because the European Union is more liberal towards immigration. That's part of the reason why England voted for Brexit, right? But that's not related to this topic. So, but while right, so um, cooperation really with neighboring states by Germany reduced the flow of illegal immigrants and somewhat abated the problem. But Germany nevertheless became, embroiled in a serious domestic debate over the rights of non-citizen residents, including the right to naturalization, which had become somewhat easier for long-term residents in the late 1990s. Um, Germany's asylum rules, they faced fresh scrutiny in 2015, and mainly because more than 1 million refugees entered the country from war-torn areas in North Africa and the Middle East. And as the government of Chancellor Angela Merkel struggled to achieve a balance between compassion and controlled entry for migrants, the political price of the stance quickly became apparent, and support for the explicitly anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant AfD surged. And in 2018, the party entered the Bundestag for the first time. And we spoke about this actually in my global class. There's a lot of nationalism in Germany right now. There's a strong nationalistic movement in Germany right now. And it's interesting because by understanding the settlement patterns and migration and the history of Germany recently, you can now understand what's led up to this moment in the present, where now we're seeing a new movement, a new nationalistic movement in Germany, and it's really anti-immigrant. Now, the population structure of Germany. So Germany is the most populous European country west of Russia. Its population density is high in comparison with most other European countries, but it's exceeded by Belgium and the Netherlands. Remember, Germany has a greater population than Belgium and the Netherlands, but the concentration of its population is high also, but the concentration of Belgium's population and the Netherlands' population is even higher. Germany actually has one of the world's lowest birth rates, and its life expectancy um, is around 75 years for males and 80 for females, according to the research I did. Um, and over the last several decades, Germany has witnessed both a positive and negative population growth in different periods. So, from the mid 1970s to the mid 1980s, the country's population actually dropped. However, Germany's experienced significant population growth, um, largely because of immigration over the following decade, really. And to stem long term population decline, governments at all levels have attempted to develop policies aimed at encouraging an increase in the birth rate, which is interesting because, in other countries like China, they're doing the opposite. And in particular, German governments have tried to subsidize childcare and provide benefits and other tax incentives to families with children. As in most industrialized countries, the proportion of the population under age 15 is quite low, about 1/8 of the total. But the proportion of those over 60 has increased dramatically, representing over 25% of the German population. And that, women predominate in the older population is largely a reflection of their higher life expectancy and the significant losses of men during World War II. But the discrepancy has become less pronounced with time. In Eastern Germany, the disproportion of elderly citizens increased significantly after the desertion of the young before the erection of the Berlin Wall and after its destruction in 1989. So, because Germany has, and we're now focusing onto the last basically subtopic, which is population distribution. Um, because Germany has for centuries, had a profusion of states, each with towns and cities, its population is more widely dispersed than that of countries such as France, in which centralization occurred early. And it's possible, however, to discern the two major population axes. The main axis runs from the Rhine Ruhr region, and it runs from the Rhine Ruhr region southward through the Rhine Main region near Frankfurt. And this is the main axis not only for Germany but also the European Union. And the second axis from the Rhine Ruhr region It's almost it runs from the central German uplands through Hanover, and some major cities stand in isolation outside the two axes. Notably Augsburg and Nuremberg to the south, and Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin. And before unification, population redistribution from the agglomeration cores in Western Germany, it was accompanied almost by a marked drift of population from the north to the booming cities and attractive environment of southern Germany. And in eastern Germany, early gains by migration were experienced in areas of planned industrial development. But after initial post-war recovery, the cities of the South lost population, reflecting industrial decline, rationalization of production, and unattractive environments. And East Berlin and its satellite towns were really the principal targets of migration until Western Germany became accessible in 1989. And that's where, then Western Germany just boomed. And then here we are to the present, where Western Germany still more advanced economically than Eastern Germany, but things have improved in Eastern Germany. Um, Most immigrants go to Western Germany if they get the choice, and there's still problems I think we spoke about earlier in the present with immigration. There's a new nationalistic movement. The With immigrants seeking asylum, it's becoming even more muddled because people are trying to take advantage of it while people are being honest, and you can't really tell the difference between the two. So yeah, that's where we are in the present, and it's very, very interesting. But it's really cool to see how the history and how it all developed really impacts the present and how life is today. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening. And yeah, I hope you listen to many more. We're going to record many more podcasts. This is the 10th episode. We're going to continue to focus on German culture. Once I've done enough where I feel like I have a really, really in depth understanding, because when I do these podcasts, I do a lot of research with them. So I probably spend maybe an hour and a half of research for each podcast. And each podcast is around 30 to 40 minutes. And um, after I really think I have a good understanding of Germany, its culture really well, and I understand a lot of systems that interest me, we might do the same thing and focus on another country in a very different region to really see the difference and how the two really contrast each other. And yeah, and we also, by the way, in the future, will be recording episodes in German too, which would be interesting too. So yeah, but thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoy, and goodbye.